It is a great pleasure to be back in St Andrews. Don't know why I left really, but various things happened. One of them was that as a teaching philosopher, I became a priest of the Church of England, and the reason I did was that I kept changing my mind so much about religious subjects that I thought if I didn't get ordained, I would never be consistent in any regard at all. So it was just a way of marking a commitment, and I thought it was quite an interesting one, because a lot of philosophers are atheists, and it's quite a normal thing to be an atheist, but it's a bit of a shock to be a believer in God, so I thought it would have a shock effect. And that worked for a few years, but then when I was turned into a professor of divinity, it didn't shock anybody anymore, and they sort of expected me to believe in God as a professor of divinity, which I found rather disappointing, really. They thought I was paid to defend that sort of thing. Well, it's quite interesting, the relation between philosophy and religious belief, and that's really what I'm going to talk about. How does it come about in our culture now that there are people who are saying, some of them are my colleagues in Oxford, though I forget their names offhand, and they keep saying that somehow belief in God is irrational, and only stupid people can believe in God. In fact, I believe they call themselves the brights, which leaves believers as the dims, of course. And you think, well, I wonder if that's really true. And how is it that this atheism has become so overt and public and popular? Because certainly some of the books by the new atheists have sold many more books than I have, and it's very annoying. They're not philosophers, really. I mean, as I've said, there are philosopher atheists, but they haven't written best-selling books. And so it's interesting to ask, well, why have the best-selling books sold so well when they're not by people whose professional interest is in questions about the rationality of belief? They're zoologists or journalists, and they usually have a scientific background, and that gives you the clue, the scientific background, I think, that somehow people have come to think that science is the new religion, or perhaps that science, not a religion, of course, they'd hate me to say that, but that science is something that tells you the truth about the world, and it's the only thing that tells you the truth about the world. And I think that's what is the fundamental philosophical position behind the new atheism. Only what science says could be true. Now, that strikes me as a completely obsolete opinion, so I just wonder why people hold it now. And I think it's because they don't take philosophy very seriously on the whole, so they haven't read about the philosophers who used to believe that only science told you the truth about the world and what happened to them. The truth is, they taught me, and then they became extinct. Now, a person I have in mind there is A.J. Ayer, Freddie Ayer. Freddie Ayer was the Richard Dawkins of his day. He was the standard atheist to make comments upon belief on the radio and in other parts of the media. And Freddie Ayer, of course, was a logical positivist. Now, I'm not going to go into huge technical details, though if you want some, perhaps with a drink afterwards, I can be persuaded to bore you to death. But without being very technical about it, a logical positivist is a person who thinks that if any statement you make is to make sense, if you can make sense of it, there must be some way in which you can have a sense experience that shows it to be true. And that Ayer called the verification principle, that any statement you make, you must have some sense experience which could show that it was true. And if you can't think of any sense experience that would show that a statement was true, then it doesn't even have a meaning. It's not even false, it's just senseless, really. So when Ayer was asked whether he believed in God, he would say, no, I don't believe in God because I don't know what the word God means, but I don't disbelieve in God either, because I can't disbelieve in something which has no meaning. And so the question makes no sense. Now, of course, that is an absurd thing to say, but he did say it. So I'm glad to tell you that before he died, he changed his mind. Not that he believed in God, but he did come to think it made sense. He gave up the verification principle. Why? Well, the point of the verification principle, before I say why he gave it up, was to rule out things like God, because clearly you can't verify God. I mean, if God is the creator of the universe and beyond space and time entirely, and has no body and no physical manifestation, then there is no possibility of verifying the existence of God by a sense experience. Whatever sense experience you had, you could always give it another interpretation and say, well, that doesn't show that there's a being who is beyond space and time and who gives rise to the universe. How could you verify such a thing? In fact, Freddie Eyre, of course, couldn't even verify that there were other people in the room when he was giving seminars. He could see bodies, of course, but those bodies, he thought, were only collections of sense data. They probably didn't have minds. They weren't thinking anything. We, on the whole, supported his view about that by not thinking anything. But nevertheless, he had a problem. It's still a standard problem in some first-year philosophy courses, I think. How do you know that anybody else is ever thinking anything? But Eyre had a more serious problem because he had a problem about whether it made sense to say that they were thinking anything if you couldn't have a sense experience which showed that they were thinking something. And it's quite difficult. That's a difficult little problem. Anyway, so there's the verification principle. The point of it was to show that, this was the idea of it, only science can tell you the truth about the world. That's the agenda. Because people like Eyre thought that science depends upon sense verifications. Right? So you come to know that something is true in science by verifying it, by having a sense experience in a laboratory, and other people can come along and have that sense experience as well, and then you've verified it. And if you can't do that, if it's not a part of science, in other words, it doesn't even make sense. So that was the hidden agenda, not so often hidden either. If you have to verify everything with sense experiences, then only science tells you the truth about the world. Okay, there were two big things wrong with this, completely wrong with it. First of all, that's not what science is like at all. Now, when I say what science is like, there are all sorts of sciences, and I don't want to give the impression there's only one way of doing science, but let's take a way which is quite popular at the moment, particle physics and quantum mechanics. And Michael Green, who's just been appointed as professor in Cambridge after Stephen Hawking, and his theory of superstrings. Now, no doubt everybody's heard that. There's somebody called Michael Green who's just been appointed to Cambridge and thinks that there are superstrings. Okay, right, so it's true, he does think that. If you ask Michael Green or any other quantum physicist at all how you could possibly verify the existence of superstrings, they will say to you, and somebody's going to catch me about this afterwards, I know, but they will say to you, we don't actually know. And we haven't thought of any way of verifying their existence, but maybe there is one, you never know. But the best reason for accepting the theory of superstrings is that it's a beautiful, elegant theory which would explain lots of observations which we haven't made yet, but we might make one day. And if we made them, I'm afraid you wouldn't understand them, but nevertheless, if you go to the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, something strange may happen, and that may be a verification of something. But it will be disputed anyway as to whether it is or not. The point is, in that sort of physics, in that sort of particle physics, the whole of observation is deeply theory-laden. If you put most of us in a Large Hadron Collider and say, would you just tell me if you can find a Higgs boson, right? We would be stuck. I mean, we could stay there for years, and whether or not there was a Higgs boson in our vicinity, we wouldn't have the slightest idea. And if somebody came along and showed us a printout from a computer saying, look, there's a Higgs boson, we'd say, looks like a lot of squiggly lines to me. How do you know it's a Higgs boson? And he said, well, we just make that up. We say that's what a Higgs boson would do, and it's done it, so it must be a Higgs boson. Actually, a Higgs boson is that particle called a God particle. And one of my friends, the Bishop of Oxford, was asked to go and speak at the Cheltenham Book Festival about the God particle, because they thought bishops must know a lot about that. He had to ring me up and ask me what the God particle was. And luckily I was able to tell him, because Higgs is not far from here, of course. Higgs he has said that he called it the God particle because he said, God knows what this is. So it hasn't got much to do with the divine creator. Anyway, the point is that things that people are theorizing about, superstrings, or even worse, the multiverse. Let's just think about that. I mean, this is quite a serious proposal. Many of my colleagues in Oxford in quantum mechanics do believe, they really seriously believe, that every possible universe exists. Every possible universe. So there's a universe in which I am speaking to you now, but there's a universe in which I stayed in bed. Okay. And there's another universe in which I'm halfway between staying in bed and speaking to you now. Right? In fact, every possible state I could be in, I am in some other universe. Well, Occam's razor doesn't work very well for that theory, but they have reasons for believing it. Now, supposing you say, are there other universes, that is, other space-times than this? These colleagues of mine will say, yes, we believe that there are. And if I say to them, how can you verify this? They say, well, of course you can't verify it. You can't have a sense experience that shows you there's another universe. What you do is you construct a very complicated technical theory from which it would follow that there probably would be other universes which you can never test. Right? Now, that's cutting-edge science. And so to say that science relies on the verification principle is just an absurd thing to say. It's just not true. Of course, it's good to have some experiments, and it's good to test things, and testing is important, but it's not the most important thing in physics. You would be rather disappointed as a physicist if you couldn't think of any test, but your test might come a long way down the theoretical line, and you couldn't even think of what the test would be without a whole lot of purely mathematical theory. And that mathematics, of course, you may not even be quite sure how to interpret. And again, quantum physicists disagree a lot about how to interpret the mathematical formulae. Some think that the mathematics actually tells you something about the real world out there, which is nothing like this. Michael Green's universe has 11 dimensions, and it's filled with probability waves and quivering superstrings, which are very small, which nobody could ever see. That's his universe. But other people will say this is just a mathematical device. It's not a real universe. That's a construct of the mind to explain funny things that happen in this universe. So physicists who theorize about physics don't agree about the status of what they're talking about. Some of them are realists, that is, they will say, I am making theories which correspond to something in objective reality. But others are non-realists, and they would say, no, these are just constructs. They're mathematical devices. They help you to do things, but there's no real world like that. There's no many universes, actually. There's only this one universe. So I'm not going to resolve that problem or anything like it. All I'm saying is verification is not the most important thing in science. It's one of the things you would like to be able to do, but often you can't do it. And just as important in modern science, and in fact, it's always been just as important, is the use of mathematics to enable you to construct beautiful, elegant, intelligible theories which help you to understand the universe. But it's not a matter of looking and seeing just like that. Go to the Large Hadron Collider and you look at it and you learn nothing. It's better not to go, really. Just do the mathematics. And unfortunately, if you can't do the mathematics, you never know what's going on, and that's the position most of us are in. So most of us are in the position we'll never know what physicists think the real world is like. So Ayer was about as far from the truth as you could possibly get. He thought that science depends upon giving you simple observations that anybody could make, you see. That's the whole point of it. Anybody. These are public observations. We can all have them. We can all agree about them. And that's the solid ground of science. Well, I'm just saying it absolutely is not. That most of the cutting-edge developments in physics today are such that most of us couldn't even understand what they're talking about. Perhaps you've read, I'll just give you one more example of this to show you how weird things can be. A serious article in Physics was published recently, and you've probably heard popular reports about this, about why the Large Hadron Collider isn't working. I mean, it's actually not working. The real reason is that the magnets were made in the USA, but so I won't elaborate on that. But one theory published in a journal as to why it's not working is that Higgs boson, one of the things they're looking for in the Large Hadron Collider, is actually such a dangerous particle that it's very secretive and doesn't want to be discovered, and it came back from the future to stop itself being discovered. Well, as the New Scientist, a very widely read popular science magazine in Britain, said, well, this may sound crazy, but at least it's not religion. Which makes you wonder, really, how it is that you can say apparently crazy things in physics and get away with it, but in religion you're just called an idiot if you say there are many universes, many possible universes that exist. Well, a physicist can say that, but if a theologian says it, oh, they're crazy. But of course theologians say it in this sense. Theologians say every possible universe exists in the mind of God. That is to say, God is a conscious, being which conceives of every possible state of affairs that ever could exist. That's part of what it means to say that God is omniscient. So that's commonplace for a theologian. But that's not physics for some reason. That's theology, and therefore something quite different. Well, I wonder if that's true. Physics has got to a very interesting place now. So that's the first part of what I'm saying about the verification principle. Science is not a matter just of looking and seeing. It's not the case that science is just interested in this world that we can see and touch and feel. In fact, I think most physicists would probably say this world that we can see and touch and feel is, if we can say anything about it, it's not the real world at all. That in fact, it's something that the mind constructs. And for at least a lot of quantum physicists, then like John von Neumann, for example, or various other, Henry Stapp, quite a few other well-known quantum physicists would say that as a matter of fact, the real world consists of something we can't even imagine. So it's not something we could ever sense. And this is very reminiscent of Plato for a philosopher. Plato's distinction between appearance and reality. And the world of appearance is the world we see with our senses, whereas the world of reality is something that could be known, if at all, only by the mind. Now, modern physics is surprisingly like that. The world of coloured, solid objects in 3 dimensions that we appear to live in could be just a construct of the mind, an illusion. There are physicists who say, friends of mine in Oxford, who say time is not real, okay? In the sense that we experience it. I mean, I think I do one thing after another, and I think I go, this morning I got up, and today I'm giving this talk, and a few minutes later I'll do something else. But there are physicists who say, no, actually everything exists. All time exists. The future exists and the past exists, and it's called block time, and it's all there. Albert Einstein believed this. And Albert Einstein found it a very comforting thought. Perhaps only Albert Einstein could find it a comforting thought, that your past is still actually existent. But he found it comforting because he felt he didn't have to believe in life after death because everybody was still there anyway. Okay. He just couldn't communicate with them anymore. But everything in time was there. So our sense of going through time is illusory. Now, Stephen Hawking often, if you've read, page 235 of A Brief History of Time, as I'm sure you have, then you remember that he says that time can change into space. Space and time are coordinate dimensions which could be interchangeable, and possibly at the beginning of this universe, at the Big Bang, perhaps time was spatialized, so time could even change into space. Well, I'm just giving you that as an example of the funny things that physicists say and expect us to believe them. Now, do we believe them? What attitude do you take to statements like that? Do you accept them on faith? Because people who can think more clearly and more mathematically than you can have done experiments which seem to suggest that this in some remote area might be true? Or do you use your common sense and say, no, they must be misinterpreting what they're doing? Science has got to a very strange area where it seems to have lost touch with common sense and ordinary belief altogether. Now, of course, zoologists haven't got there. Okay, and people who are zoologists, and I will mention the name, all right, Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a very good zoologist. What he knows about is animals. That's what he knows about. He's an expert in animals. He's not an expert on quantum physics. So he doesn't say anything about quantum physics. He doesn't even mention it. A few pages in one of his books. He's very wary of talking about it. And that's because in zoology, of course, you're talking about appearances. You're talking about things as they walk around us, as you can see them. But if you're a physicist, you're talking about things not as you can see them, but as only the mind can conceive them. This 11-dimensional space, Hilbert space, in which probability waves somehow exist and alternate states might exist simultaneously, right? That's not anything you can see or hear or feel or touch. So when we talk about science, I think you have to say, well, what sort of science? And if it's fundamental science, like physics, asking the really fundamental question, what is the universe made of, ultimately? Is it made of matter? And you ask a quantum physicist, and they probably say, well, I wouldn't use that word. Anyway, energy is perhaps nearer, but then that can take a million different forms, so you haven't really answered very much by talking about that. So I don't want to go on too much about this. I just want to say my first point is just science is not looking and seeing. That's my point. It's much more theoretical. It's much more a matter of mathematics, of intelligibility, of beauty, of the mind, and what the mind can think. And maybe, and I incline to this, that's the reality, what the mind can grasp, but the senses cannot even imagine. That is the reality, which is very different from the world we seem to be in. In fact, it's a world beyond space and time. It's, strictly speaking, a supernatural world. And that's the irony, you see. The word natural, as used by many philosophers, means in space and time. So if you have something existing by nature, certainly G.E. Moore used it this way, you mean it's in space and time. It can be observed. It is the way you see it to be. Something that's supernatural will be something beyond space and time, and in a sense of greater ontological reality, prior to the existence of space and time. Well, that's exactly what quantum physicists talk about. If you're a quantum cosmologist and you raise the question, what accounts for the origin of this universe at the Big Bang 13.5 billion years ago, then they might come up with a sort of suggestion, and that suggestion is, well, there is a realm beyond space and time from which this space-time, and perhaps many other space-times, originate. So it's beyond space and time. Is it deeply intelligible? Yes, because the laws of quantum physics apparently apply there, otherwise we couldn't talk about it. So it's a deeply intelligible world. Well, I think that's a supernatural world. So physics has got into the supernatural. It's not a world of ghosts and spirits, but it's a world of intelligible realities beyond space and time. And that is much closer to traditional Christian theology than you might suppose, because Christian theology traditionally is not about ghosts and spirits. It's about a timeless, changeless, eternal reality from which this space-time originates. And the Christian doctrine of creation, as described by theologians like Thomas Aquinas, for example, but many others too, is that creation is not the beginning of this universe. That's a mistake. The creation is not how the universe began. The creation is that everything in space and time depends for its existence on something beyond space and time, a reality which is intelligible, and of course, for a believer in God, which is conscious, and which gives rise to this space and time. Well, many physicists might be skeptical about the conscious bit, but they might be very sympathetic, and in my experience they usually are, to saying, yes, there is something beyond space and time upon which this space-time depends, and it is intelligible, and it is beautiful. So that's not so far from traditional theology. The big difference is, do you make this reality conscious or not? And so you come to the problem of consciousness. But I'm going to come back to that, because what I've been saying now is the verification principle was meant to show why only science tells you the truth about the universe. It falls down because science doesn't even operate with the verification principle. Science does not say, unless I can give you a way of having a sense experience which will show that this particle exists, it doesn't even make sense for me to talk about this particle. Right? Science doesn't accept that statement, so it doesn't even accept the verification principle. That's the first half. The second half won't take as long on the verification principle, and that is, all of us know things which are not at all verifiable, but which we believe to be true. Every one of us in this room, except the philosophers probably, will agree that we all have knowledge of something, of some truths, which there is no way of verifying. And let me demonstrate this, because some people are looking remarkably skeptical. And so last night, or the night before, you had a dream. Now, many of you will have really had a dream. I mean, some of you will have read philosophy and you'd say, no, I didn't have a dream. I just woke up thinking I'd had a dream, but I didn't actually have one. Okay, that's a philosopher's remark. But most of us know we had a dream. All right, you dreamt about something. So do you know that you dreamt about something? Suppose you dreamt about being in the Bahamas. You probably say, yes, I know that I dreamt about being in the Bahamas. Is it true that you dreamt about being in the Bahamas? And you'd probably say, yes, I think that's true. I believe that to be true. So, question, how could you verify that you dreamt about being in the Bahamas last night? There is no way on earth that you could verify that. It's not that other people can't verify it, even you can't verify it. You can't go back into your dream and find out whether or not it was the Bahamas you were dreaming about. You can't even convince philosophers, all of them, that you were dreaming about anything at all. Because if a materialist philosopher says you weren't actually having a dream, your brain just functioned to make you think you'd had a dream, you can't refute that either. Well, let me put that the same point in a slightly different way. If you have a cat or a dog, do you think it has thoughts and experiences, that it feels pleasure or pain? Well, I put it to you that you actually don't know. Whatever you think, Descartes thought that animals didn't have thoughts and feelings. Most people in Scotland think they do have thoughts and feelings. Only some animals have thoughts and feelings. Cats and dogs and horses. Mosquitoes, probably not. It's not an animal, of course, really. So you sort of draw the line at the ones you don't like very much. But how do you know? But it still makes sense to say that maybe an ant crawling around an anthill is thinking, what a lovely day it is today. Does that make sense? But to some of you it will, and even if you don't think it's saying that, it's having an experience of some sort. It's probably having a smelly sort of experience, because ants work by smell. Well, anyway. But the point is, nobody is ever going to resolve that question. But it's not a senseless question. Do ants feel? Or do dogs feel? Do dogs think, even if they haven't got a language? You will judge by inferring from behavior or something, but you can never actually tell. We do experiments in Oxford on pain. We do pain research. We put people into an MRI scanner, and we give them electric shocks of varying intensities at unexpected intervals. The only difficulty is that we can't get volunteers. But we carry out these things and we see what happens in the brain. Now the point is, suppose you ask the question, are they really feeling pain when you prick them? Or is their brain just registering on your scanner and that's all there is to it? Is that a sensible question? Well, I certainly am convinced it's a perfectly sensible question and a very important question to ask. Are they really feeling pain or not? And there'd be a point at which you would actually not give them such a great electric shock in future because they felt too much pain. But how do you know when they feel too much pain? Well, the answer is when they start screaming, basically. But they have to tell you whether they're feeling pain. I mean, one of them could say, no, I'm just screaming and I'm not actually feeling any pain. I just scream when this happens. And this brings us to the subject of materialism. Okay? And so what I've been saying here is the verification principle fails anyway, not just because science doesn't actually rely on verification, but also because we all know that certain things are real sensible questions which have real sensible answers, which we might differ about, but we still have opinions about, which are not verifiable. There's no way of telling which of us is correct. I'll give you one more just for good measure. Is the human will free to do what is wrong or what is right, or not to do what is wrong or what is right? Well, you know that philosophers write PhDs about this endlessly, and you know that philosophers are never going to agree about whether human beings have free will or not. Some will always say they have, and some will always say they haven't. So there's another question, which is a factual question. Are people free to do otherwise than they actually do, which there's no way of resolving, or if there's a way, nobody's found it in thousands of years of thinking about it. And we can't think of any way of resolving the issue. We have arguments about it, but we don't resolve the issue, and certainly not by having a sense experience. So there are a whole lot of questions, real questions, about what is true, what is the case, that we can't resolve by verification. And God, of course, is one of them. Is there a God is one of those questions. There's no way of verifying that. But the point is, it's the wrong question. You shouldn't be asking, how can you verify it? God, like free will, and like the consciousness of other people, is something you're never going conclusively to prove or disprove by any sense experience at all. What's the alternative? The alternative is, can you fit the idea of God, of a conscious being who envisages every possible universe and chooses this one for a good reason? Are you going to be able to fit that belief into a coherent and plausible and appealing scheme of what you think the world is like, a metaphysical view of what the universe is ultimately like? That's the question. It's not a verifiable question, but it's a real one, and it's the ultimate question about theism and atheism. And atheists are basically, these days, the new atheists anyway, they're basically materialists. What is a materialist? In the sense in which I'm talking about, they are people who assume, as well as assuming that only science can tell you the truth about the world, which is wrong, they also assume that actually everything that exists and everything that could exist has to have location in space-time, because that's what matter has. Matter is something which has extension and location, probably mass. You can dispute a little bit about that, but material particles are in space, and that's what they are. So a good expression of materialism is Francis Crick. Francis Crick, one of the Nobel Prize winners for discovering the structure of DNA, who in a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis said, your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs, everything you experience, you are nothing more than the movement of neurons and associated molecules in your brain. That's what you are. Nothing but that. Now that's a good statement of materialism. So there's nothing in you, in your thought, in your experience, in your dreams, in your feelings and intentions, than things that happen in your brain. And just note how different this is from saying, well, unless things happened in your brain, you wouldn't be having any thoughts. I'm not going to dispute that for a moment. And I'm sure it's true, unless you had a brain and it was working properly, you wouldn't be thinking and feeling. But to say that your thoughts and feelings are nothing but the physical movements in the brain, which the philosopher Daniel Dennett, for example, does say, is a very different view. And certainly Richard Dawkins is a materialist in this sense. He actually says there could not be any consciousness at all, which was not the result of a long physical evolutionary process in which a brain, a complex physical organ, was developed. And consciousness only arises once the brain has come into existence. And that, he thinks, is true. So let me ask the question, how would he know that that was true? He's not just saying that all the consciousnesses I come across in animals and human beings are consciousness which depend upon a brain. He's saying a lot more than that. He's saying there couldn't be a consciousness which didn't depend upon a brain. And that's why he's an atheist, because God is clearly a consciousness. God is aware of what exists and what could exist. So God is conscious, but God has no brain. Right. God has no body. God is not physical at all. So if you believe in God, you're, in a traditional sense, as I do, then you're committed to thinking there could be consciousness without a brain. So if a materialist says, but no such thing is possible, are they saying something which is verifiable? Well, I think not. That's not a verifiable statement. And it would be very difficult to know that it was true, that there could be no consciousness without a brain. I think you'd have to leave it as an open possibility. There might be. So that means that the new atheist arguments are just taking materialism for granted, and that is exactly what they do. There's a scientist called Richard Lewontin in the United States, a very eminent scientist indeed, who says we, scientists, take the view of materialism, because we are committed to not letting there be any spooky events or acts of God in the universe. As scientists, he says, that's what we're committed to. And I think you'd find a lot of practicing scientists who haven't thought much about religion particularly, but they assume religion is just a lot of funny things that funny people do and they have no personal interest in it, think that the religious people are people who have a scientific hypothesis which can't be verified, and so you could drop it. And that to be a scientist, you have to say there are physical causes for every event, and therefore we can't allow there to be any non-physical causes. We're committed to materialism. So there's the question. Are scientists as such committed to being materialists? I hardly need say, because of the existence of this series of lectures, if nothing else. But there are lots of very good scientists indeed who are not materialists. So what's the evidence that you have to be a materialist to be a scientist? I would have thought one of the things you'd want a scientist to be would be open-minded, open to new possibilities, open to the thought that not everything has yet been explained. There are some things that we might need some new forms of explanation in the future. In fact, Roger Penrose, who with Stephen Hawking devised the mathematical formulae for black holes, and Penrose was professor of mathematics in Oxford, and he actually thinks that modern-day science is almost obsolete, even quantum mechanics, because it needs to be supplanted by a new form of science, which we can't yet imagine, which will include consciousness as one of its variables. The reason he thinks that is because at the moment, quantum theory is not fully consistent with relativity theory. There are lots of problems around. And so Penrose looks for a revolution in science. Not everything will become false. It'll just become less adequate as an explanation. And he thinks the more adequate explanation will include consciousness. Now, of course, nobody knows whether or not that's true, but at least it's an open-minded attitude. And I think that's a truly scientific attitude. You say there are lots of things we haven't managed to explain, lots of mysteries in the universe, thank goodness, and we do want to try to explain them, and that's what science is all about. But what sort of explanation will be needed is very difficult to say. Since the 16th century, scientists have, on the whole, excluded purpose from science. That is, you never, as a scientist, ask the question, what is the purpose of something? You exclude that question. In fact, biologists, in my experience, get totally frenzied when you try to suggest there's a purpose in anything. I was asked to speak to the Oxford Zoology Department recently, goodness knows why, and I did. Richard Dawkins is a member of that department. And when I suggested there might be a purpose in evolution, it might be going somewhere, there might be a direction, and even that it's pretty obvious what the direction is. When you look at the history of the universe from the Big Bang, where there is no consciousness, nothing of any value, nothing going on, just one simple, relatively simple state of infinite gravity, mass, etc. And then you get to now, where things have gradually, and over millions of years, become more complex, more integrated, more organized, until you get the fantastic structure of the human brain, which allows consciousness and value and intention to exist. You say, doesn't that look like a direction? It looks like a direction from simpler to more complex. It looks like a direction from unconscious to conscious. It looks like a direction from having no value, there being nobody around to appreciate the value anyway, to a state in which we can create and appreciate values as conscious beings. That looks to me like progress, and it looks to me like direction, and it looks to me like purpose. That's without bringing God into the thing. Well, these zoologists went mad. And they said, you can't talk about that. We're all purely accidental. There's no purpose. Bacteria are perfectly happy. They've been around for millions of years and they haven't evolved. So, how can you say it's just that its purpose is just accident that some things happen to originate? And I just had the question, well, how do you know it's just an accident? Is that a scientific statement? A scientist can perhaps show how things happened, that it happened this way. But if you ask the question, and did it have a purpose? Was there a goal? Was it moving in a certain direction? That's not really a scientific question. You're moving into metaphysics. You're moving beyond experimental science, beyond even theoretical science, to ask ultimate questions about whether there could be a purpose in a universe without a God, or whether if there were a purpose, it would imply a God. And that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid that if you brought purpose into it, you'd be really implicitly saying there's a God, there is a consciousness who conceives the purpose and who sets things up so that that purpose will be realized. And that is, in fact, what they are afraid of. And it is what purpose in evolution implies. Now, I would think that the question, is there a purpose in the way that evolution works, is a very important and a real question. The answer might be no. But I think when you look at the process, it seems to be yes. That is to say, it looks as though complexity, organization, consciousness, and the ability to have intentions is built into the structure of the laws of nature from the first. It looks like an unfolding of potentialities which are meant to be there, rather than it looks like one series of accidents after another. But then I'm moving into metaphysics. But aren't scientists moving into metaphysics when they say we are committed to materialism? And so I think the ultimate issue here is not actually between science and religion. That's not the issue. It's a philosophical dispute about whether materialism is true, whether you can reduce all conscious events to material events in space and time, or whether the opposite is true. And the opposite, the view which I hold, for example, is idealism. And idealism is the view that actually matter is the expression of mind, that mind is the ontologically prior reality, that mind expresses itself in matter. And of course, that is what it means to believe in God. To believe in God is not to think there is a material universe over here, and over here there is a God who is outside the material universe but keeps interfering from time to time. To be a believer in God is to think this very material reality is shot through with mind and consciousness and purpose and value. God is the mind at the heart of the being of this universe. God doesn't ever have to interfere in this universe because God is continually keeping the universe in existence, and whatever it does is, sooner or later, done by, permitted by, allowed by, caused in the end by God. So the theistic hypothesis is not a scientific hypothesis, it's a metaphysical hypothesis. It says, in its traditional form, mind exists without matter. Matter cannot exist without mind. Mind, the mind of God, is a consciousness which envisages every possible state there could be and chooses for a good reason, which would include having us here, if that's a good reason, who creates this universe in order that we should exist and have the destiny that God intends for us. That's a metaphysical theory. It's not a theory of religion as such. It doesn't involve, as such, prayer and activities like that. And it's not a theory of science as such. But it relates to both science and religion, because the scientific view of the universe must be consistent with there being a purpose and a direction. There must be at least hints. There must be something that makes you think this could possibly be true. But belief in God is not a scientific theory. It's a commitment to a personal relationship with the mind of being. The mind of God, religious people feel, is in some way open to being known by us, or even makes itself known to us in various events of our cosmic history. So that's the sort of dispute it is. And I think to be clear about the distinction between a philosophical theory and a scientific hypothesis and a religious commitment to prayer and meditation and the activities of religious groups is to become clear about where the argument really lies. You can be an idealist and not be a member of a religious group. And that's another topic. I would say to be a member of some religious group is necessary to keep the idea of the mind of being as a living, fruitful idea that makes a difference to people's lives, because we need to tell each other how we experience that mind. And we need to be aware of how limited we all are in coming to know it. So I've been wanting to make the difference between views of science and views of religion, and to say what is wrong with the new atheism is a twofold thing. First of all, they have a misconception of what science is. They think it's all like zoology, whereas a lot of it is like quantum physics, and it's got very weird indeed and passes beyond the visible into a veiled reality from which space and time originate. And secondly, the new atheists are wrong also about thinking that science as such presupposes materialism. That's a philosophical view. Science doesn't presuppose it. Science is neutral as to the truth of that. But it would be true that you would be more disposed to be an idealist if you had fruitful and positive and life-enhancing experiences of a mind which is known through the events of your experience, but which underlies the whole of the universe. That, in the end, is experience of God. And I think that's what religious belief is founded upon. And the investigations of science, I would say, should be encouraged to help us to understand more and more about how such experiences come to us and how they can be seen to be authentic, although beyond final, conclusive verification. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joel Kitchen. I will try to make this brief as possible. First of all, thank you very much for speaking. I found it very interesting. I don't think that many atheists would disagree that religion is a different way of looking at the world. I think you've given certainly no reason not to believe in it, but in terms of positive reasons, I'd just like to know your response to the classic problem of evil question.
The problem of evil? Okay. Well,
therein lies the problem.
Yes, I think that is a major problem, but actually it's not a new problem. I mean, the problem of evil has always been a problem for believers in God, and I don't think that evolutionary biology adds to the problem at all. It just says, look how much suffering there is in the world, and we say, yes, we always knew that. You know, so that's not a new feature. It's not part of the new atheism. Though I think it's the major objection to belief in God. I agree with that. What can I do with it? Okay, this is going to be very, very crude. And this is what I personally think, that God is the cause of everything that happens, but some things that happens God intends to happen and wants to happen, but other things that happen God doesn't intend, doesn't want them to happen, but he can't stop them happening. So that's what I think.
But this one is omnipotence.
Yes, you're limiting God's omnipotence, yeah.
Who is anyone to limit God?
Sorry?
Who is anyone to limit God's omnipotence? I mean, how can we, surely the part of the conception of God is that this is an omnipotent being, so surely we can't limit God.
Well, that's not necessarily true, actually. I mean, you could say part of my definition of God is that God is omnipotent, but you could have a conception of God where God wasn't omnipotent. Why not? In that sense. I mean, you can define, if you define omnipotence as my God can do anything that is statable in a logically consistent proposition, then I would say I don't believe in that God. There's too much suffering in the world for that to be true. I mean, it's possible there could be such a God, but I mean, there isn't. Okay, so my God is limited, my God, the God I think about, the God I think is in the Bible, is a God who is more powerful than any other being could possibly be. But that is not, philosophically speaking, a God who is able to do absolutely anything you could state in a consistent proposition. There are necessities. This is a standard theological view, actually. There are necessities in the being of God which mean that God has to be the way God is. Perhaps Spinoza is the philosopher who comes nearest to this. And among theologians, Friedrich Schleiermacher explicitly says that. God has to be the way God is. So God has no choice about that. God intends good, but God has no choice about everything that happens. You asked me, and that, maybe you may find it unsatisfactory, but that's my short answer. Yeah.
One thing you might like to do is have a look at the lecture that John Polkinghorne gave as part of the Gregory series. It's on the website, and his whole lecture was devoted to the question of suffering. And of course, as Keith said, there are no simple answers. But I think at least of all the different religions, suffering is right at the heart of the nature of Christianity.
Yeah. If I can just support the Polkinghorne type of argument, it would be this, that if you could show in science that this is the only universe that could possibly produce carbon-based intelligent life forms, you would have answered the question.
A bit of homework for you.
I just like to say, somebody's taking an interest in creation science, and also Genesis. I mean, I realise that there's a high percentage of people now who no one believe in Genesis. But the thoughts that come to my mind are, could be in relation to quantum physics, Not that I know a lot about it, but I was wondering, in the Bible it states that God created the world in 6 days. And also somewhere in the scripture it says that 1 day with God is 1,000 years with man, or you could say 1,000 years with man is 1 day with God. But surely if we're talking about that, then obviously you're talking about different timescales, very, very different timescales.
Yeah.
I mean, is there anything going on in theology now at the moment to consider the fact that perhaps when God created this world, the timescales were totally different indeed? So therefore, when it says God created the world in 1 day, could it perhaps have been a thousand years in a particular time scale? I wonder if this is coming up at all in the theology of the day.
In theology?
Or philosophy.
The trouble, in theology, I think we tend to pay more attention to what the early church writers like Augustine said about Genesis and how they interpreted it. So Augustine said, that you couldn't interpret day as a period of time at all, for the reason that God doesn't create in time. Rather, the whole of time is created by, this was Augustine's view, you see, the whole of time is created by God, and the mistake is to interpret Genesis as a sort of historical account of what happened at the beginning of the universe. So you'd be for Augustine, you'd be confusing the theological doctrine of creation, everything depends on God and only on God, with a doctrine about history, about what happened at a time when there was nobody there to observe it. So Augustine's view is fairly clear on that it wasn't meant to be a literal account. And virtually every Christian writer believed that until the 16th century, when people began to think, people got more literalistic, and in fact it was the rise of science which made people more literalistic. They began to think, the only true things are literal things, because that's what scientists are telling us. You could see them, you could be there. And so there was a big change in theology in about the 16th century, and that's when creationist doctrines about 6 days began. I wouldn't mock them at all. I'd just say if you're paying more attention to the first 1,000 years of Christianity, that view was virtually unknown.
Good evening. You said that science will probably never prove God or disprove God, but when we consider what science has done perhaps over the last 300 years, it's certainly demystified the world as such. When we consider floods and volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, we no longer view that as punishment from God or such like, certainly in the Western world anyway. Do you think perhaps science in the next 100 years could even make God, a personal God as such, as obsolete?
I mean, it's no competition really, because it's. But if you say that, what you're thinking is that God is a scientific explanation. I mean, why does the flood happen? Because God sends it to punish somebody. That's a sort of scientific explanation. You're saying that I'm explaining why this happens by bringing in God. Now, again, most theologians have always said that is the wrong approach. You shouldn't be. I mean, supposing almost everybody thought that they were being punished by having a disease, right? Christian theologians have always said that is the wrong way to look at it. And Jesus himself, said people aren't punished because they've done wrong. The book of Job says that. It's punishment. That link is a false link. So just disconnect yourself from that thought completely from a religious point of view and say, look, if I fall ill, God is not punishing me. Somebody might think that, but that's not religion. That's not the Christian faith. The Christian faith is that this universe, which God has created, operates according to laws, according to which some people will get diseases, and that's it. And if you get a disease, it's tough luck. It's not because God didn't like you. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Okay? So I think God is not a scientific explanation at all in that sense. Just doesn't come into that. And if you're talking about God, you say, whether I've got a disease or not, I can have a personal relationship with a being of supreme value. That's not a scientific thought. So it's not going to make God obsolete. Do you see what I mean? It's not a scientific theory, so it can't be rendered obsolete. It's like saying, will science render music obsolete? Well, no, it won't.
Yes. Alan Gibson. Going back a couple of speakers ago, you were talking about limiting God being limited or limiting God.
Yeah.
And then you talk about the involvement of God in creation, in the created world.
Yeah.
Does this, in your view, extend to important religious concepts like the incarnation and potentially resurrection, and even more personally, healing in however form you can care to think about it, whether physical or holistic?
Well, I think that it is the incarnation of God in Jesus which leads people like me to think that God is not omnipotent in that sense of having power which God exercises to determine everything. Because I see the incarnation of God in Jesus as God giving up divine omnipotence in order to serve and become weak. So for me, an important message of the Christian doctrine of incarnation is that God does not exercise omnipotent power. Right? So that's how it strikes me. But of course, naturally as a Christian, I think Jesus rose from the dead. And so I think that's an important message about suffering too, which I didn't mention, but that the suffering of this life is not the end of a person's existence, and that resurrection can put things in a very different perspective. So I certainly do believe that. Yeah. I think that notion of omnipotence, sort of the notion of an all-determining God, is in tension with the view of Jesus, who gave up equality with God in order to share in our humanity. Do you see what I mean? That's a very Lutheran thought. It's a very typical of Lutheran theologians.
Hello, Alden McRae. You mentioned during your lecture that at the beginning of time, at the Big Bang, all material in time was at a singularity, and that now life in the universe is vastly more complex. How would the new atheists rectify that with the law of entropy?
Oh, well, that wouldn't be difficult, really, because they just say that entropy occurs throughout the universe as a whole, but of course you can, in small parts of the universe, collect energy temporarily and build up complex things. But entropy is going on in the whole universe. So in the end, it'll all run down. But in the meanwhile, we can have little eddies of fervent activity, if you like. Right? But they'll all run down in the end, yeah.
My name is Samuel McCullough. In the United States, it's something like 60% of people don't believe in evolution. Do you think that the new atheism is kind of a pushback against this anti-science, well, not anti-science, but fundamentalist Christian no-earth creationist view that is predominant in the United States and growing in the United Kingdom?
Yes, I think that is true. That is a major factor, I think, which gives it force. And of course, Dawkins could always find people who are. I mean, the problem is, it may, perhaps the world was created in 6 days. I mean, if I'm going to be open-minded, I have to say, well, it's a possibility. But when the vast majority of educated scientists disagree with that, you have to take that into account. You have to say, do I really want to fight this battle? Is that what I want to fight? What I really want to ask about is, can people have a personal relationship with God as their Savior? I really want to talk about that. So do I want to get into, a fight with most of the major scientists of the world? But that is the fight he's having. And I think the end of that fight is yet to be determined. I think that creationists, people who believe in six-day creation, will actually change their minds. Just as those who opposed Galileo changed their minds. It took them 300 years, some of them. But nobody now thinks that the sun goes around the earth. And yet that was a major religious dispute based on an interpretation of the Bible which took it literally. That was given up. And I think the same thing will happen to creationism, but the answer to your question, is this what Dawkins is against? The answer is yes, it is, yeah.